everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hannah Yu, Curator of Public Programs at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. The Fowler is pleased to present today's Lunch and Learn program focusing on key works and themes in our current exhibition, Descanse and Paz Memorial Paintings from 19th Century Mexico, with Lilly Endowment Curator of Art and Religion, Patrick Polk. Patrick Polk serves as a lecturer in UCLA's Study of Religion program. His research interests include material religion and visual piety, religion and healing, popular religion in North and Latin America, and African diasporic sacred arts. He has curated Fowler exhibitions such as The House Was Too Small, Yoruba Sacred Arts from Africa and Beyond, Botánica Los Angeles, Latino Popular Religious Art in the City of Angels, Sinful Saints and Saintly Sinners at the Margins of the Americas, and Axé Bahia, The Power of Art in an Afro-Brazilian Metropolis. If you have any questions during the program, please submit them to the question and answer function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote entries that you would like to be considered to be answered by the curator throughout the program. And now, over to you, Patrick.
All right, thank you, Hannah. It's my pleasure to be here. I'd also like to welcome everybody who's participating in this online presentation today. I mean, we really appreciate your support and your presence. So I'm going to go ahead and start a PowerPoint that will take us through some of what I want to talk about today. And then also, as Hannah said, please do, if you have any questions, submit the questions for question and answer. I'll try my best to clarify anything that I've said, add any information, any extra details that people might like. So please don't hesitate to make this as interactive as is possible. Okay. All right, so I'm going to walk you through some key elements of the exhibition that's currently on display here in our Fowler and Focus gallery. I hope some of you maybe have had the opportunity to already come and see the exhibition. If you have, I'm glad you're here today because this is a chance for me to add some content, some context that you wouldn't see in the exhibition in the physical space. For others here this is your first encounter with this exhibition, and if you have the opportunity to come to the Fowler and see the installation and additional objects, again, we would welcome you to do that. Okay, another highlight. We're coming to sort of the end of the run for this exhibition. So, all right, November 3rd, we're closing at a very, very opportune date if you have to ever close at all, as we're going into that time period of basically All Saints Day to All Souls Day, those periods of commemoration for the dead certainly within the tradition of Catholic Church. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, the exhibition is fundamentally about 19th century Mexican portrait traditions. The two specific genres we're going to get into. One represents nuns, in particular crowned nuns, a very uniquely Mexican style of representation of professed nuns, women who've taken the vows and professed into an ecclesiastical position, in convents and working in and contemplating in a particular role within the church. And so we're going to talk about those portraits as a tradition of memorializing, commemorating daughters, sisters who have taken on that vocation. And the other category of memorial commemorative paintings that are highlighted in the exhibition represents deceased family members, children, husbands or wives. But in particular, what we have on display is fundamentally portraits of deceased children that would have been painted after the fact and kept in the home. Again, to symbolize someone who was once in the home physically, but is no longer there. And so the paintings materialize their presence in a particular kind of way. It keeps them in the family, in the place of residence, as we more often tend to do with photographs now in, say, the contemporary United States, where there's an object that allows the dead a certain presence, a lasting presence in the place of the living. And so those are really the fundamental ideas of the exhibition of what we put in the gallery. And again, as we go through here in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll highlight some key points. I'll dig into some of the portraiture and mention some specific kinds of details that I know I find particularly fascinating and intriguing and important within the traditions. And again, certainly, if you got any questions, throw them in there. Uh, all right, I want to start with really contextualizing the collectors. The almost all of the objects on display in this exhibition were donated to the Fowler Museum by the Cordrys, Donald and Dorothy Cordry. They are an American couple. They were artists who began really their story that I want to start here, and this is to help understand their collecting of the objects that are on display and the ways in which they lived with these objects, what they meant to them, and how they used them, and also how and why these works came to us. So Donald and Dorothy, and the top three photographs there are Dorothy, and the bottom three are of Donald. They were born in the Midwest. They moved to New York City as young artists. Uh, Dorothy, painter, sketch artist. Donald he trained as a puppeteer. He was also a set designer and a painter, and so they're very much dedicated to artistic expression in their own careers, their own lives, and also so they moved to New York, and these photographs were taken in an apartment in Greenwich Village, and so they sort of develop as a couple and in sort of a cultural creative space, sort of as sort of a bohemian uh, context. And so they meet and then they marry in 1936, and then they move to Mexico, where they spend the rest of their lives in Mexico, first in outside of in the District Federal outside of Mexico City, and then they live in Cuernavaca, and they resided in a number of places, but they moved there in 1937, and they spend the rest of their lives there. Uh, Donald dies in roughly 1980, Dorothy approximately 10 years later or so. And so, but they moved to Mexico as a lot of certainly the other artists from around the world, United States, different countries in Europe, who found a certain kind of romance in Mexico. And I mean that in a couple of ways. A romance of building a life in another country as expatriates, and in a romance with aspects of Mexican folk culture. The Cordrys became very, very interested in, especially Donald, in documenting, researching, collecting traditional arts in different regions of Mexico, with a real focus on indigenous traditions, so native communities in Mexico. And so they assembled a quite large collection of masks from festival traditions, of textiles and other art forms that they published a series of books on. They and right, it became their life. Being in Mexico, working with Mexican artists and working as artists themselves, became just the focus of their existence, if we want to say it that way. And it was a real love. And these two images I have here sort of exemplify sort of how they put themselves into that place with their artistic uh, skills and practices. And and so on, is that these two watercolors, the watercolor of Donald was done by Dorothy, and the watercolor of Dorothy was done by Donald. So they're painting each other. There's a passion here in multiple levels. It's a passion for a life together. It's a passion for a place of Mexico and certain parts of Mexico, and then a passion for the artistic traditions in there. Uh, so in addition to researching and documenting and collecting, they also become dealers, and they open up an art gallery, and they serve for decades as a conduit of traditional crafts and arts in Mexico to collectors worldwide. So it's really again, a very intricate engagement. And I see there was a question, do we have any Donald's puppets in our collection? And to my knowledge, we do not. What came to us from the Cordries were some very specific aspects of their collections. Masks, textiles were the main works, and some furniture from the house. And what I'm going to really focus on today, and the focus of the exhibition of what came from the Cordries, was a number of works that they lived with. And what I want to do today, and this is a little different from what you would see in the exhibition, is that these paintings, were objects that they collected early on in their life in Mexico, and that they kept in their home. And in fact, they kept them in several homes. And it really wasn't until after Donald's death and and Dorothy's death that they came to the museum. So what I'm going to do is also show you some of these several of these works, talk about them, but put them in a very specific kind of context in terms of the Cordries. So here's a photograph that was taken of their last home in Cuernavaca. And what you can see here is, well, all of these paintings here, except for the large one in the middle, are in the exhibition. And so basically I don't know if you can see my pointer jumping around the screen, but other than the large painting of the girl in the middle, the other six paintings are on display. And these are a genre, they represent a genre of post-mortem paintings. So that if in the 19th century, and this is prior to the advent of accessible photographic technology, uh, really, honestly, the only way to really have a lifelike remembrance and image of a deceased loved one in the home was to have it painted. And again, this is a tradition that would track with middle class, upper middle class, or elite families. But these, in all likelihood, were the only likenesses ever created of the individuals depicted. And they would have been painted by itinerant painters who go from town to town, village to village, place to place, and offer their services to create mementos, commemorative works for people who have left, physically left. But right, are there in memory? They're in hearts that still exist as part of the family, even though they're not physically present. And so this painting tradition gives an opportunity to have that image in the kitchen, have that on the mantelpiece, so to speak, to have that presence remain. Now, by the time we get further into the late 19th century, into the 20th century, this tradition has fundamentally been replaced by photography. And post-mortem photographs become quite common in the United States and Mexico and elsewhere. I mean, that's a tradition that today might feel a little weird to people, to have a photograph you take of somebody when they've died, and then send it around to relatives or keep it on display. But certainly in the beginning of the photograph, right, or the use of photography, quite natural thing to do. But also the main thing I'm trying to say is that this is a tradition that largely was replaced by photography. And again, any other questions? Anybody else want to throw any questions in here? Ask for any clarification. I'm keeping my eye on that because I do love to, as much as possible, respond and address people's questions. Okay, so now what I'm just continuing this idea. What I want to do is have us look at a nice contemporary photographic image of one of the paintings that is currently on display and have it juxtaposed also to how it was displayed in the Corddry's home. And so this photograph of a young boy, uh, I mean, this painting of a young boy, we can see in their home, they had it fundamentally kept it in, part of the decoration of the dining room. And clearly what the Corddrys were doing is decorating their living space in Mexico in a way that connected to artistic traditions, craft styles of Mexico. And so one way to think about their collecting of these kinds of paintings and displaying them was an effort to try to be as part of a place and with regards to aesthetics and the use of art, right? And so their home in Mexico for better or worse was an effort. Again, I use the term romantic effort to sort of be within the milieu. And so they purchased paintings like this, and these would have been acquired from antique dealers or in art markets in Mexico City in all likelihood. And then they chose to live with these images. And there's a lot involved in that in terms of living with these images. One of the things I want to highlight is just the reality of how people become separated not just from their relatives and loved ones through death, but also through time. That these these paintings would have once been in a home where the deceased lived, and these paintings of this type would have been with their families. But over time, over generations, not only do we become distanced from our flesh and blood kin, but also we become distanced from the objects, the images that commemorate them. So over the course of a few generations, uh, the memory can become disassociated with the object. And this is true of paintings. This is true of photographs. I'm sure if many of you have been to swap meets, yard sales, or antique stores and see the boxes and boxes of photographs that were used to be in someone's home, that people knew who was in those photographs, and over time they become disassociated. And so another way to think about what the Corddrys were doing, we're collecting, giving a new place, a new home to individuals who had been displaced. So another example of at one point in their house, this painting was in a living room, in their living room with a frame. And in the old photograph, the frame was in all likelihood, may have been made by Donald Corder himself. Now I see there's a question. Someone asked, did the Corders find out who these individuals were? Not to my knowledge. Other than a couple of the paintings in the exhibition have the names on them. They have the name, these first name or full names of some of the individuals. But I think that one of the things for some of these, unless the name is spelled out, it is really, right, that is another form of disappearance that's hard to overcome. So a painting like this particular painting here is the individuals remained anonymous, and the Corddrys were pretty good at documenting and giving information about 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 their art collection. But in some ways, and this is what happens with portraiture over and over and over. We maybe are left with the image, with a vision of a person, but not a name or not a family or no more context than that. So again, thank you for that question. And again, anyone else have any more questions? Now, a couple of things I want to highlight about this painting in particular, and about some of the conventions of postmortem painting. Now, this painting, when this painting was made, this child would have been deceased, and this wouldn't have been painted from life. In all likelihood, this would have been painted by somebody who never saw the child, whether alive or dead. and certain kind of conventions were of how you paint the deceased. One with features that aren't necessarily highly recognizable. Kind of a generic child, large, chubby head, wearing a child's shift, a child's gown. But the kinds of things that are part of the tradition here to recognize one are the rattle, the toy, and the flower. And the flower fundamentally is one marker of that this child is deceased. And the floral sort of funerary flower there. Uh, in today, if you go to a Day of the Dead festival, often the flowers associated with death from a perspective, a contemporary perspective, often is the marigold, these yellow flowers and orange flowers that you'll see in altars, ofrendas, and shrines for the Day of the Dead. And that's sort of historically a very local, sort of more like Oaxacan tradition. For the 19th century, the use of flowers for death, for the deceased, whether it be a saint in the Catholic Church or a child from a local home, more often you're going pink, white, reddish flowers as that symbol. And so sort of the key things we're looking at this, the flower and the rattle, this is a child, who was loved, the flower, a child who was loved, the rattle, the toy. But there's another aspect in here that we can read specifically about love and care. And it's these two marks here, these two brown marks at the temples, right here on the child's forehead. And what those represent are chiquilladores. And there would be poultices applied, would have been made out of herbal plant medicine. They're applied to temples as a treatment for fever and other kinds of illness. And so this being painted into this, literally we can read it as this child was loved, child was cared for. This child is deceased. The child died. But anybody looking at the painting knows that people tried, that parents, family, relatives tried, because here's the medicine that was applied to this child's forehead, that their effort, cures were applied. People, right? So this was a full expression of cared for, loved, tried to use medicine, tried to cure the child. It didn't work. Now I see another question. There are other painters anonymous? Yes. Yes. And this frequently goes with some painterly traditions, is there's some things you put your name on and then others you don't. And you wouldn't necessarily put your name as an artist, as a painter, onto the canvas in this sense, right? It has a different kind of function. And so yeah, we don't have names for these folks. So again, it creates this really sort of resonance of anonymity in a number of ways. All right, now I'm keeping a watch eye on the clock here, and I don't want to hold folks too long. And again, I really appreciate folks being here for this. Here's another photograph from the Cordries when they were in the federal district, living in the federal district in a house. And we have in the exhibition two portraits of nuns, of classic crowned nuns from the Mexican tradition. One depicting a younger woman, would have been at the time that she professed. She took her vows of chastity, of poverty. And then the other painting of an older nun that was highlighting near the end of life, a life of service. Potentially, this is painted post-mortem. Not, we just don't know. Sometimes these were painted in life, sometimes painted after death. But the most important thing is that they celebrate their rite of passage into leaving the world, the everyday world, Monday world, and entering into service to church, to God. And when I say that, this is important to understand what that really means as a transformation. Here's another photograph from the 1940s, earlier at the Cordries house, with the young nun in kind of a dining room setting. And now I was just talking about one genre in the exhibition of family members who've died. And right, mostly children who've died. And so a physical death and a removal from the household. And but the painting gives them a presence. In the case of nuns, going into the convent, it has a number of ways we can think about it symbolically, purposely symbolically conceptualized. One, a nun taking her vows is it's a social death in the sense that it is a rejection of the world. A nun becomes the ritual is it is a wedding. She becomes the bride of Christ. And if you look down on the left hand of the nun on this slide, you can see that she has on a wedding ring. She is married Christ. She's married the church. And she holds the emblems, floral emblems that highlight, in this case, right, dedication to Christ. There's an image of Santo Nino de Tocha. Central on her crown is an image of Saint Francis, and she also wears the belt of a Franciscan. So she's a nun who was going to be cloistered. In other words, she moving away from the world in association with particular institutions within the Catholic Church. And so it's a wedding, but it's also a funeral. And to go back to what I said earlier, to be cloistered means to leave one's home forever, to leave the mundane outside world forever, to go into a convent, to be closed in for religious purposes. And so when you see a painting of a crowned nun from this tradition in Mexico, you have to understand that this is a person who, again, most likely never ever went back to her family home. And her family may never have seen her again. And so frequently these paintings would be commissioned by families and would be kept in the home as, again, as a memento, as a reminder, as a continued visual presence of someone who is no longer in the home. And so again, these are the two fundamental genres of deceased, the physically dead, those who have passed away, and then the symbolically deceased, those who have moved away and are no longer in the home, even though they may be living. So again, just rounding this out, and here we have these are the two paintings in this exhibition of nuns, and just to highlight a few things here. Again, the flowers would in all likelihood at the time would have been maybe fabric or wax. These would have been the regalia of nuns that would have been used at their time of profession, and all quite in all likelihood, quite at least possibility they were perhaps buried with these as well. I see someone ask, are the giant candles realistic? Absolutely. Absolutely. Those would have been a central part of rites of the church, including profession into a monastic order. And so these are things that these represent actual objects. The shield on the older nun's chest, her cascudo, these were worn during profession, and they also signal particular affiliations with denominations within religious orders within the church, or specific incarnations of the divine. The incarnation of the Virgin Mary in the center of the cascudo, the shield breastplate on the older of the nuns. It highlights Our Lady of the Apocalypse, and the older nun was affiliated with a Capuchin monastery in Oaxaca. And so they highlight both the removal from the home, the leaving of the family home, but the going into a new place of residence, into a sacred enclosure. And so, in both genres, in these particular paintings here, and in the ones of children, both styles sort of highlight loss, someone who's no longer present. But they also can work to, right, to grieve in certain ways, and you would grieve both of these, the physical death and the social death, but also become right. The presence uh, can be a continue right afford a continuation of a togetherness, and then that could be pride, that can be remembrances of the happy. They can identify, they can highlight the larger picture. Right. In some of the paintings of the children, I didn't include them here. If you can come to the museum, I hope you see them. Often they very much present the deceased children as angels, right? And they're resting in peace and they're in a better place, right? Part of a larger spiritual understanding that helps us, clearly helps people deal with the process of processing death. And then in terms of the nuns, these are also objects of pride, right? We have a daughter. Our sister is in the church. Our sister is a servant of God. Our sister our daughter is on the path to a good and holy death as an ecclesiastic figure, right? So a lot going on. And so I hope that I see now it is 101, and I believe we had just a half an hour. So I hope that you've all gotten something out of this. And are there any questions? Are there any other questions? Anybody else has any other queries? Questions for me? I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, thank you very much. Would love to see you here at the museum.
Yes. And Patrick, thank you so much for giving our online audience a walkthrough of Descanse and Paz, memorial paintings from 19th century Mexico. We received several interesting questions and comments. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Descanse and Paz is on view at the Fowler Museum at UCLA until November 3rd. Please be sure to sign up for our newsletter to learn more about upcoming programs. And related to Descanse and Paz, we have an in-person gallery talk with Patrick Polk and Professor of Art History and Chicano Studies and Associate Director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, Charlene Villasenor Black, on October 25th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. And on November 1st, we have an in-person program with Patrick and Professor Cesar Favela, Associate Professor of Musicology at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, about his latest publication, Immaculate Sounds, The Musical Lives of Nuns in New Spain. Today's program has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Fowler website for you to revisit and share in a few weeks. I hope you'll be able to join us for our upcoming public programs at the Fowler. Have a great rest of your week, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.